Subscribe, click the like button, and turn on notifications so you never miss another unforgettable story. The moment hit like a cold gust of wind. One sentence, that's all it took. Sign here or get out. I froze mid-bite. The roasted chicken on my fork suddenly felt heavier than the world. My parents sat across from me. Calm faces, unreadable expressions. My mother's eyes were steady, but her hand trembled just slightly. My father's jaw was tight, his fingers drumming against the table. The paper between us wasn't just a document, it was a line drawn in the sand. I couldn't breathe for a second. Shock rolled through me, sharp and disorienting. Everything I thought I knew about this evening, this family, this life, collapsed in a single moment. Just seconds ago, the room had been warm, alive with the hum of conversation and the smell of home-cooked food. Now it felt cold, hostile, like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. "Excuse me?" I asked, my voice trembling, despite my best effort to stay composed. "Sign it," my father repeated, firmer this time. "Or leave. It's that simple." The words reverberated in my chest. Leave? Everything I had built, everything I had known, it could all vanish in an instant. Childhood memories, family dinners, the safe familiarity of this house. Gone. I stared at them, trying to process. My mother's gaze flicked to me, then down at the paper. She was waiting for the reaction she wanted. Fear, desperation, obedience. But it didn't come. Not from me. I placed my fork down slowly, carefully, my heart hammering. I had to think. I had to measure my next move. One wrong word, and it would all be over. I need some time, I said, soft but firm. Time? My father repeated, disbelief creeping into his voice. This isn't a request. It's your choice. Sign or leave. I understand, I said, trying to steady my shaking hands. It's just big. I want to make sure I make the right decision. A silence fell. My mother's lips pressed together. My father's fingers froze mid-drumming. I could see their surprise, the first crack in their carefully controlled performance. They hadn't expected me to pause. They hadn't expected me to resist the pressure. I wanted to shout, to cry, to beg. Part of me screamed. But another part, the part that had learned patience the hard way, knew something important. This wasn't about the document. It was about control, about testing me, about watching me squirm. And I wouldn't. I thought back to every time I had been overlooked, dismissed, or betrayed. The cousins who got the praise I deserved, the friends who were trusted more than me, the promises that were broken with a shrug. Every slight, every quiet injustice added to a growing fire inside me, not of anger, but of clarity. I smiled, small and deliberate. Letting it hang in the air, my parents' eyes narrowed. They didn't understand. They thought I was wavering, trying to play games. But I wasn't. The rest of dinner passed in a blur. My parents asked questions, attempted small talk, tried to make me comfortable, but every word was a reminder of the ultimatum. Every glance across the table felt like a challenge. I nodded. I sipped water. I kept my composure, all while my mind raced. By the time dessert arrived, I knew what I had to do. Not out of spite, not out of rebellion, but out of principle. I wouldn't surrender to fear. I wouldn't let a single signature decide my worth, my loyalty, or my future. "Have you decided?" my father asked, tapping the paper again. Impatience had crept into his voice. "I have," I said, calm and measured. "I will not sign tonight." Shock, confusion, disbelief. I watched my mother's hand tremble as she reached for her glass. My father's jaw tightened further. "You're making a mistake," he said, almost pleading now. "Maybe," I said softly. "Or maybe it's the first step to understanding what really matters." I left the table with steady steps. No slammed doors, no raised voices. The house behind me felt tense and silent, as if it too were holding its breath. Outside, the night air was cool, crisp, and freeing. The street lights cast long shadows across the pavement, stretching like reminders of the choice I had made. For the first time in years, I felt in control. Not of them, not of the house, not even of the business, but of myself. And I knew this: patience, observation, and quiet planning could achieve more than anger or confrontation ever could. The first move had been made. The first step towards justice, towards truth, towards balance. And in the silence of the night, I smiled again, knowing one thing for certain. When the reckoning came, it wouldn't be loud, it wouldn't be messy, but it would be undeniable. The story had begun.
I walked back to my room that night, the cool air brushing against my face, and I couldn't stop thinking about how things used to be. Just a few years ago, this house had felt safe, warm, alive. The laughter of family dinners, the teasing between cousins, the quiet conversations with my parents after everyone else had gone to bed, it all felt so ordinary, so unshakable. I remembered one evening clearly. I must have been 12. My father had pulled me aside in the kitchen while Mom washed the dishes. "Your uncle's been talking," he said, his voice low, careful. "He thinks you're too young to understand business." I had frowned, "But I can learn. I want to help." He had looked at me, long and steady, then sighed. "Maybe, but you have to understand. Family comes first." I had nodded, trusting him, believing him, believing them both. And for a while, it worked. I watched them navigate meetings, phone calls, and negotiations, trying to understand what they understood. I wanted to belong, to be included, to be trusted. I thought I was. But the cracks were already there. I remember another night, sneaking down the hall to find my cousin in the study. Papers were spread across the desk. Plans, contracts, letters. I hadn't meant to spy, but curiosity got the better of me. "Why are you taking his side?" I asked, voice shaking. "My side?" My cousin laughed, shaking his head. "He doesn't care about you. You're too naive. Don't you see? This is how things work. You either play the game or you don't get to play at all." I had stepped back, hurt and confused. I didn't understand then. How could someone I trusted, someone who called themselves family, say something like that? Over time, I learned. I watched them navigate meetings, phone calls, and negotiations, trying to understand what they understood. I wanted to belong, to be included, to be trusted. I thought I was. But the ultimatum that night, the paper, the threat, the expectation, showed me how deep the betrayal ran. I had lost more than comfort. I had lost trust, not just in them, but in the sense of home I had carried all my life. I sat on the edge of my bed and opened a drawer I hadn't touched in months. Inside were old letters, photographs, and journals. I picked up a folded note in my mother's handwriting. It was from years ago, tucked away and forgotten, and the words made my stomach twist. "Remember, it's not about being fair. It's about surviving. Don't let anyone catch you off guard." I had read it before, but tonight it felt different. It wasn't guidance. It was a warning. I realized then that some lessons had never been about love or trust. They had been about control, about who could bend and who could stand firm. I flipped through more papers and found something else. A ledger, old business documents, letters of promise. The dates, the amounts, the agreements, they didn't match what I had been told. Some promises were broken silently, quietly, with excuses that made sense only to those who were already in on the plan. And that was the moment it hit me. Not everything I had believed about my family, about loyalty, about fairness, was true. There had been manipulation, quiet favoritism, and subtle betrayals that I hadn't noticed as a child because I had trusted too much. A memory surfaced then. My birthday 2 years ago. I had asked my parents if I could lead a small project for the family business, something I had been preparing for. They smiled, nodded, praised me in front of guests. But when the party ended, they quietly reassigned the project to my cousin, saying I wasn't ready. I had felt foolish, embarrassed, and angry, but I swallowed it. I didn't know then that it wasn't about readiness, it was about preference, about controlling who had the power and who didn't. I leaned back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. My room, once a sanctuary, now felt like a place of quiet revelation. The betrayal was not sudden. It had been years in the making, hidden in smiles and praise, in reassurances and false encouragement. What I had lost was not just an opportunity. It was the illusion of safety, of trust, of belonging. But even in that loss, a new clarity emerged. Understanding the past gave me tools I hadn't had before. I could see the patterns, the manipulations, the subtle games. And with that understanding came a decision not to fight blindly, not to lash out, but to plan, carefully, calmly, with patience. I reached for my journal and began to write. Notes, observations, reminders. Everything I had seen, everything I had remembered, everything I had learned in silence. And then, at the very bottom of a drawer, I found it. A small envelope, yellowed with age, tucked beneath old receipts and forgotten cards. Inside was a letter addressed to me in a hand I didn't recognize at first. It wasn't from my parents or my cousins. It was from someone outside the family, someone who had been keeping track of the business and its promises quietly, carefully, for years. The letter said one simple thing: there is more truth here than you realize. Look closer. Watch carefully. The story isn't over. I held it in my hands, feeling the weight of it. A chill ran down my spine, not from fear, but from understanding. This was the pivot, the moment when past betrayals and hidden truths collided, and the real story began to take shape. I knew then that the next step wouldn't be reaction. It would be discovery, observation, planning. And in the quiet, I would begin to see who I could trust, who I could not, and how the scales of fairness might finally tip in my favor. The night was still. The house slept. But for me, everything had shifted. The past had opened its door, and I had stepped inside. And that's when I realized the story I had believed all my life wasn't the story at all. The morning light spilled across my desk, hitting the papers I had spread out the night before. I didn't touch breakfast. I didn't check my phone. I simply stared at the notes, at the patterns I had traced, at the subtle hints of truth buried in years of careful observation. I realized something important. Revenge didn't have to be loud. It didn't have to be dramatic. It could be deliberate, quiet, and clever. I could restore balance without anger. I could show the truth without cruelty. That idea brought a small, almost imperceptible calm to my chest. I started with small steps. A phone call to a former business partner who had once trusted my instincts. a casual conversation with a cousin I hadn't spoken to in months. Each interaction was careful, friendly, unassuming. I asked questions, listened, remembered. Notes filled my journal with neat handwriting. Times, dates, promises, patterns of behavior. Every detail mattered. At first, it felt strange to act without emotion, to move without confrontation. But soon, I felt strength building, the kind that comes from clarity, not anger, the kind that comes from knowing the truth, even when others are blind to it. Pain had shaped me, yes, but it had also sharpened me. One afternoon, I found myself in the study, pretending to review documents while watching my parents' routines. Their movements were predictable, small habits that betrayed their priorities and their judgments. I didn't spy to punish. I watched to understand. I didn't want chaos. I wanted balance. "You've been unusually quiet lately," my mother said one evening, her voice casual but with a hint of suspicion. "I've just been focused," I replied, keeping my tone light, neutral. A lot to think about these days. Her eyes narrowed, just slightly. She glanced at my father, who nodded in acknowledgement, but I caught the brief flicker of concern. A subtle clue that my observations were not being unnoticed. That small shift told me I was already moving the pieces on the board. I also began reaching out to allies I had overlooked before, family friends who had always been kind, colleagues who respected honesty. I asked questions carefully, shared small truths, and watched reactions. Every conversation added clarity. Every answer revealed patterns, and every pattern revealed what had been hidden in plain sight. The more I learned, the more my purpose solidified. This wasn't about proving a point. It wasn't about embarrassment or punishment. It was about fairness, about restoring integrity to the family and the business. Subtle, intelligent, undeniable. One evening, while reviewing old contracts, I noticed a discrepancy I had never seen before. A promise my parents had made to a longtime client, quietly changed years ago, shifted slightly in wording. The consequences were small on the surface, but significant beneath. I realized that the adjustments had benefited my cousin at my expense. Small favoritism, carefully hidden, repeated over time. That discovery changed everything. It wasn't just about the ultimatum at dinner anymore. It was about a pattern, a repeated preference, a quiet injustice that had gone unnoticed for years. And now I held the evidence, not in anger, but in clarity. The next day, I brought the ledger to a trusted mentor, someone outside the family circle, and walked through each line with calm explanation. They nodded, impressed with my attention to detail, my patience, my understanding. They didn't flinch. They didn't question motives. They saw what I saw. Balance had been disrupted, and someone needed to restore it. Back at home, I noticed the subtle signs that my parents were sensing a shift. A longer pause before a question, a fleeting glance at my notes, a hesitation in conversation that hadn't been there before. They didn't know exactly what I had discovered, but instinctively they felt the tide turning. "I thought you'd sign by now," my father said one evening at dinner, voice calm but measured. "Are you reconsidering?" "I'm thinking carefully," I replied, my eyes steady, my tone neutral. A lot to think about these days. That small exchange carried more weight than they realized. My calm, my focus, my deliberate patience. All of it signaled that I was no longer playing the game their way, and I could see it in their faces, the first hint of unease. By the end of the week, I had assembled everything I needed: facts, observations, and clarity. I didn't need confrontation yet. I didn't need dramatics, but I was ready. Quietly ready.
The scales had been tipped in my favor, invisibly, imperceptibly. And then it happened. While organizing some old correspondence, I found a single note tucked behind a folder, written in my father's handwriting. It wasn't addressed to me, but it revealed a worry, a fear that he hadn't shared with anyone. The words were careful, almost dismissive, but the meaning was clear. Someone was paying attention, and it made him nervous. I held the note in my hand and smiled quietly. The shift was happening. The subtle, smart, moral path I had chosen was already making waves. The person who had betrayed trust, the person who had demanded compliance, was beginning to sense that the balance was moving. I closed the folder, my hands steady. The journey wasn't over. The confrontation wasn't imminent. But the first pieces were in place, and the first hints of awareness had begun to show on the faces of those who thought they were in control. In the quiet of the evening, with the house asleep around me, I knew something powerful. Patience, intelligence, and moral clarity could achieve what anger never could. The story had returned to the present, and now the game had truly begun.
The morning was quiet. The sunlight spilled across the kitchen table, glinting off the papers I had prepared. I didn't hurry. I didn't shout. I simply waited. My father entered, carrying his coffee, the usual calm in his step. He paused when he saw me. There was curiosity in his eyes, but also the faintest flicker of caution. "Good morning," I said, voice steady. "Do you have a few minutes?" He frowned slightly, but nodded. "Of course. What's on your mind?" I gestured to the papers. "I've been reviewing everything. The agreements, the promises, the business records. I wanted to go over a few things with you." He took a slow breath. "All right, let's see what you have." We sat. I handed him the documents, carefully marked with observations. I didn't accuse. I didn't raise my voice. I just let the evidence speak. Some of these entries, they don't match what I was told. Some promises were adjusted, reassigned. It seems certain opportunities went to others over me. He looked down, fingers tightening around his mug. For the first time, he didn't try to explain or redirect the conversation. Silence stretched between us, full and tense. I didn't notice at first. I trusted that what I was told was accurate. I believed the fairness of the decisions. But over time, patterns emerged. I can see now that choices were made that didn't include me. He didn't speak. His gaze was fixed on the table. My calm voice, my quiet presence, seemed heavier than any raised tone could ever be. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. Gently. Was it to protect me, or did you think I wasn't ready? He swallowed. I thought I was doing the right thing. I wanted to shield you from mistakes, from disappointment. But by shielding me, you removed the chance for me to grow on my own. You removed trust, not just opportunities. The air shifted. I could see it in his eyes. Realization. A quiet guilt settling in. He hadn't expected confrontation without anger. He hadn't expected clarity instead of blame. "I didn't realize," he admitted finally. "I thought it was better this way. I never considered that it would feel like betrayal." I nodded. "I understand why you acted the way you did. But understanding doesn't erase what happened. It just shows me the truth. And knowing the truth changes everything." He looked up then, eyes meeting mine, a mix of regret and concern. I suppose I misjudged how important it was for you to be included, to make your own choices." "Yes,"
I said quietly. It wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about proving a point. It's about fairness, clarity, and trust. That's the balance I want restored. The room was still. The sunlight highlighted the subtle lines on his face, the first signs of understanding. I realized then that confrontation didn't need shouting, tears, or anger. Quiet power, the ability to remain composed, to speak truth calmly, to show evidence without theatrics, hit harder than any dramatic outburst ever could. I see now, he said slowly. I misstepped. I thought I was protecting you, but I see I was controlling instead. I nodded. It's not about blame. It's about awareness. About learning what really matters, and it's not too late to correct it. He exhaled. A long, slow release. I don't know what to say. Say that you'll try, I replied, voice steady. Say that you understand the choices you made, and that you'll see the value in including me, moving forward. He looked at me, truly looked, and I could see the weight of his realization. His shoulders relaxed slightly. I see it. I see how I've underestimated you, how I've underestimated the consequences of my actions. That was the moment, the shift, the quiet recognition that the story wasn't just mine, it was ours. That the betrayals had left marks, yes, but that understanding and moral balance could reshape everything. I stood and collected the papers. It's a start. I said softly, we can rebuild trust. Carefully, thoughtfully, but it begins with honesty. He nodded, eyes misting slightly, not from shame, but from comprehension. The dynamic in the room had changed. Where there had once been authority and expectation, there was now respect and acknowledgement. The tension that had defined years of subtle betrayal began to lift, replaced by something more powerful, possibility. I walked to the door, leaving him to reflect. He didn't follow. He didn't protest. He simply stayed, absorbing the quiet lesson, the undeniable truth, the weight of reflection. For the first time, I felt it fully, the power of controlled emotion, of thoughtful confrontation. The path of revenge had become a path of restoration. The shift wasn't just in him, it was in me. I had learned to wield patience, clarity, and moral strength as effectively as any confrontation could have demanded. And as I closed the door behind me, I knew one thing. The story was far from over, but now anyone who had ever underestimated me could see that the rules had changed, the balance was tilting, and the next chapter, where actions followed words, was about to begin.
The house was quiet that evening. The soft hum of the heater filled the space between us as I sat across from my father again. The papers were gone now. What remained was honesty, laid bare in the simplest form. I need to explain, he said, voice low but steady. Not as a justification, but as truth. I leaned forward slightly. My expression was calm, my heart steady. I had learned patience. I had learned clarity. And now, I was ready to hear it. You remember the projects I reassigned? He asked, nodding toward the table. It wasn't favoritism. Not entirely. There were decisions I made based on fear. Fear that you would take on too much, that you might fail, that the responsibility would crush you. I blinked, letting the words sink in. Fear. That was his motive? Not manipulation, not spite, not control, but the fear of losing me to the weight of responsibility. It didn't erase the betrayal, but it painted it differently. I thought I was protecting you,
I thought I was doing what was best, but in trying to shield you, I overlooked your strength. I didn't trust you as I should have." I stared at him, taking it in. The anger I had carried for years was no longer sharp. It had dulled into understanding. Hurt remained, but clarity had replaced the confusion and shock that had once consumed me. "You didn't see it," I said softly. "You didn't see how it felt to be left out, to be trusted less than I deserved. You didn't realize that protection can feel like betrayal." He nodded, a tight nod that spoke of regret and self-awareness. "I understand now. I see it clearly, and I see that I've been wrong." The weight in the room shifted. It wasn't dramatic. There were no loud outbursts, no slamming doors. It was quiet, reflective, deliberate. The power of this moment wasn't in anger. It was in the acknowledgement of truth. "And the ultimatum?" I asked. "The paper at dinner?" "That was—" He paused, struggling for words. "An attempt to push you into action, to force clarity. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. I see that now. I misjudged the way to help you understand the importance of decisions. I only made it feel like a test, not a choice." I took a slow breath. The full picture was emerging. Every betrayal, every slight, every overlooked opportunity. Most of it wasn't about me personally. It was about fear, caution, and misguided intentions. The truth softened some of the edges, but it didn't erase the lessons I had learned. "And now?" I asked. "Where do we go from here?" He looked at me, eyes steady, honest. "We rebuild. Carefully, thoughtfully. We include you. We respect your voice. We don't hide things. And we don't assume we know what's best for you without asking." I nodded. It wasn't easy. It wasn't sudden. Trust couldn't be restored in a moment. But the first step had been taken. Acknowledgement, understanding, and a willingness to change. I could feel the moral choice stretching out before me. I could respond with anger, demand more than fairness, push for dominance. Or I could respond with balance, with forgiveness, with thoughtful guidance. The temptation to assert control was real, but it didn't feel right. I wanted justice, yes, but justice shaped by principle, not impulse. "Then we do it differently," I said finally, voice calm. "We move forward together, with honesty, with inclusion, with respect." He exhaled, a long, slow release of relief, and relief that bordered on gratitude. "I'm willing," he said quietly. "I've been blind for too long. Thank you for showing me." The room seemed to breathe with us. The weight of the past wasn't gone, but the air had cleared enough for understanding to settle in. And yet, even in this clarity, the decision wasn't complete. Forgiveness wasn't automatic. Balance wasn't guaranteed. I had seen the patterns, understood the motives, and faced the betrayals, but I still had to choose how far to let the past influence the future. Could I forgive fully? Could I trust again? Could I let go of the desire to assert moral authority and instead guide the family with quiet wisdom? The questions lingered, heavy and unspoken. My father looked at me, waiting, hoping, uncertain. The responsibility rested not just with him, but with me now. How I responded would set the tone for everything that came next. I leaned back slightly, my eyes distant but focused. The past had been revealed, the truth had surfaced, but the moral choice, my choice, was still in motion. And in that moment, the house was silent. The future hung in balance. The story wasn't over. I didn't speak. I didn't act. I simply held the space, letting the weight of what had been revealed settle, letting the quiet power of patience and moral clarity guide the next step. The cliffhanger was subtle, emotional, and deliberate. Forgiveness or assertion, balance or control, justice in its quiet, moral form. The choice waited, and that waiting, full of possibility, full of reflection, was more powerful than any confrontation could have been.
The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, soft and warm. I sat at the table, a cup of tea in my hands, watching the steam curl into the air. The house was quiet, but it felt alive in a new way, lighter, steadier, balanced. My father entered slowly, holding a folder. He placed it in front of me without a word. I looked up and met his eyes. There was something different there now, an honesty, a respect that hadn't existed before. "I've gone through everything," he said softly. "All of it. I see clearly now what I've missed, what I didn't understand, and what I should have trusted you with." I nodded, letting the words settle. It wasn't about victory. It wasn't about proving who was right or wrong. It was about understanding, restoring balance, and letting truth guide the way forward. "I want to do better," he continued, "not just with the business, but with us, with trust, with honesty." "You already have," I said quietly. "Acknowledging it is the first step. Now it's about moving forward." There was a pause, the kind that feels both heavy and relieving. Silence isn't always empty. It can be the space where understanding grows. Then he smiled, a small, real smile, one that had been missing for years. "Thank you for showing me the right path. I would have continued blind if not for you." I smiled back, feeling a weight lift from my chest. The anger, the hurt, the uncertainty, they weren't gone, but they no longer controlled me. Balance had been restored through truth, through reflection, and through careful choice. I opened a drawer and pulled out a small envelope I had saved from the beginning of this journey. Inside was the note from the outside mentor, the one who had guided me without interference. I held it in my hands and read the simple words again. "The story isn't over. Watch carefully." Now the words felt different. They weren't a warning. They were a reminder. Reminder that truth, patience, and moral action can create their own justice. I placed the envelope back gently, a symbolic gesture of letting the past rest where it belonged. Later that day, I went to the study where so much of the tension had unfolded. I sat at my desk, looking at the familiar space with new eyes. Every document, every letter, every ledger had told a story, and now the story was complete. I picked up a small plant from the windowsill, a gift from years ago that had been neglected. I watered it carefully, watching the green leaves reach toward the sunlight. It was a small, poetic moment, life growing steadily, patiently, even after neglect. The metaphor wasn't lost on me. Growth, like trust, requires care and time. When my father returned later, we sat together without words. I gestured toward the plant. He understood immediately. The gesture was enough. No grand speeches, no dramatic apologies. Sometimes silence, care, and small action say more than words ever could. In that moment, I felt closure. The past had been acknowledged, the betrayals understood, and the balance restored. The family wasn't perfect. The mistakes weren't erased,
But the truth had been revealed, and the emotional weight of secrecy and misunderstanding had lifted. I looked around the house, seeing the familiar spaces anew. The kitchen where confrontations had begun, the study where observations were made, the hallway where memories lingered. All of it felt full of possibility. Possibility for honesty, respect, and mutual understanding. As the evening light softened, I stepped outside for a moment. The sky was painted in warm hues of orange and pink, the sun dipping slowly toward the horizon. I inhaled deeply, letting the calm fill me. The world outside mirrored the quiet transformation inside. I thought about the choice I had made: patience over rage, understanding over retaliation, moral clarity over impulsive justice. That choice had reshaped everything. The peace I felt wasn't temporary. It was earned. It was deliberate. And it was powerful. I returned inside and saw my father sitting quietly, reviewing papers, a calm focus in his eyes. I didn't interrupt. I simply stood, letting the room settle into its new rhythm. Then, with a soft, reflective voice, I said, "We've learned a lot, and we'll keep learning, together." He looked up, nodded, and smiled. No words were needed beyond that. The gesture, the acknowledgement, the shared understanding, it spoke volumes. I walked to the window, looking at the horizon. The day was ending, but it wasn't over. Growth, understanding, and trust were ongoing, but now they were guided by truth and balance, not fear or secrecy. And, in that final moment, I felt it fully. The quiet triumph of patience, the lasting power of moral choice, and the gentle justice of truth. The journey had begun with betrayal, moved through discovery, careful action, and confrontation, and now it rested in quiet resolution. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, I whispered to myself, softly, with calm certainty, "The story isn't over, but we are finally at peace." If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more real-life love and emotional stories. Your support helps us bring more meaningful stories to life.